Okay, so I'm going to pick up the discussion that I've been having by and giving a bit of a shameless self-promotion for this book that I've edited called Valuation in Media Ecology. It's Ethics, Morals, and Laws, and I'm going to put a blurb down there, uh, down at the underbar to maybe make a connection for people to check it out. I think the way that I would want to set this up is to talk about one of the peculiar aspects of the way communication and communication technologies, and we could take just language as the case, does relate to space and time in particular ways. Now, I thought it was interesting the number of people who, in their responses to one of my most recent videos, they wanted to admit that yes, words are in space and time, and then they suggested that yes, we too are in the space and time of the words. And so they were recognizing something like the spatial containment problem there. I was surprised at the number of people who didn't say that words are of space and time. I get, especially some of those hardcore materialists out there. I think I would love to hear how they're going to address that. I think Piro's concern over the kinds of action that language makes possible. I would also say yes, that was partly what I was driving, is that language is constitutive. It is a kind of action, and one of the particular kinds of action is the way that speech seems to make possible a kind of making promises that is a an entering in of a pact with others, whether one wants to go to the religious orientations of covenant or one simply wants to look at the paradoxical nature of promises as they emerged in the individual. Now, I can't talk about, obviously about this book. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own chapter. Maybe I'll see if I can get in a quick promo for some of the other contributors here. I think one way for me to contextualize kind of what I'm doing in this chapter is to just restate this line by McLuhan and Nevitt, where they say that the human is an extension of nature that remakes the nature that makes the human. This notion that we've emerged out of nature and are now remaking our nature in a kind of process, right? That the technologies mediate our experience of ourselves. And the way that I try to trace it is through different communication technologies, through orality into literacy, literacy into print, and then on to some of the new, more modern communication technologies. What I'm going to do here, rather than read a bunch of the book at you, I want to give just two passages from Nietzsche, and I'm going to first pull one from Genealogy of Morals and then one from The Gay Science. Both of these are really Nietzsche's attempt to address how the historical development of the individual emerged in basically communication practices through this problem of the detribalization and the emergence of the responsibility of conscience and how that relates to the phenomena of promises and the ability to make promises and to accept promises. Now, I'm not sure if other animals make promises. That maybe would be a question that people want to raise, but listen to hear what Nietzsche has to say. Here's what he writes. If we place ourselves at the end of this tremendous process, where the tree at last brings forth fruit, where society and the morality of custom at last reveal what they have simply been the means to, then we discover that the ripest fruit is the sovereign individual, like only to himself, liberated again from morality of custom. In short, the man who has his own independent, protracted will and the right to make promises, and in him a proud consciousness, quivering in every muscle of what has at length been achieved and become flesh in him, a consciousness of his own power and freedom, a sensation of mankind come to completion, the proud awareness of the extraordinary privilege of responsibility, this consciousness of this rare freedom, the power over oneself and over fate, has in this case penetrated to the profoundest depth and become instinct, the dominating instinct. What will he call this dominating instinct, supposing he feels the need to give it a name? The answer's beyond a doubt. The sovereign man calls it his conscience. Okay, he develops this theme again, sort of the way in which conscience is a phenomenon of nature that slowly emerged in history with the capacity to make promises, and how promises are a kind of action that require more than signs. It's not just an animal using signs as indexicals. It has to do with using signs as they can be understood by the other as from my view as well. It's a sort of pact, an entering in through the symbol. It's not just responding to the symbol from the outside. Okay, here's what he writes from the Gay Science. This is Nietzsche. He says, during the longest and most remote periods of human past, the sting of conscience was not at all what it is now. During the longest periods of the human past, nothing was more terrible than to feel that one stood by oneself. While we experienced law and submission as compulsion and loss, it was egoism that was formerly experienced as something painful and as real misery. Whatever harmed the herd, whether the individual had wanted it or not, prompted the sting of conscience in the individual and in his neighbor too, and even in the whole herd. There is no point on which we have learned to think and feel more differently. And Nietzsche here is trying to give this account of how humans are an extension of nature that have remade the nature that have made ourselves. We have slowly become detribalized largely through money and literacy. Money and literacy have created a functional anonymity, a kind of individual who experiences a free-floating responsibility and freedom that comes from the ability to make promises, including promises to oneself. The notion that we can talk to ourselves. It's not just that animals have some kinds of communication systems. The question is, can other animals talk to themselves, make promises to themselves? Can they enter into themselves? See, when I make a promise to another, there's an entering in and taking on a kind of relationship in terms of the promise that we both agree we've promised. In terms of that. Okay, I guess what I would like to do is, again, please get this book. I would love for people to pick it up. I felt so honored and so thrilled to have so many distinguished scholars. I mean, I do have a piece here from Lee Thayer. Lee Thayer was the founder and the past editor of the journal Communication, author of many books, I guess, over 19 books. Frank Dance was the past editor of the Journal of Communication and Communication Education. He's past president of ICA, it's the International Communication Association. I guess Lee Thayer was as well. He's also past president of the National Communication Association. Robert K. Logan has a chapter in there. If you know who that is, Bob Logan was the guy who wrote The Alphabet Effect. He also wrote The Extended Mind. He has a wonderful chapter in there on altruism and the nature of language and culture. Bob did do some work with with Marshall McLuhan. I also do have a piece in here by Eric McLuhan. If people know who that is, Eric McLuhan is Marshall's son. He did with his father Laws of Media. He also has many books together. He has done many books, including Theories of Communication. He has a piece out called The Human Equation with co-author Wayne Constantino. I have a piece in here by Phil Rose, where Phil Rose is kind of an young rising star who just got his PhD from I guess he got it from Toronto York University, and he has a book out called Which One is Pink on concept albums of Roger Waters. There's a piece in here by Stephanie Gibson, who is an associate professor at University of Baltimore, has done a lot of work on state execution and on execution laws in Maryland. I have an amazing, again, pair here of Phil Graham and Greg Hearn, both who are at Creative Industries in Australia, both done a lot of work. If people are familiar with Phil Graham's work on hypercapitalism, it's an amazing collection. Kathryn Egan has a piece in here, again, very senior professor, distinguished professor at the Department of Communications at Brigham Young, who's done a lot of work on phenomenology and media and also ethics. There's a piece in here by Frank Macke, if people know who that is. Frank is the professor of communication theory and rhetoric. He's also the chair of the department at communication studies at Mercer University in Georgia. Done a lot of work on phenomenological psychology and continental philosophy, as well as semiotics. He is a fellow of the International Communicology Institute. He's also done a lot of work, I guess, in North American phenomenologists. Uh, Thomas J. Farrell, if people know who that is, again, a very distinguished scholar who's done a lot of work on Ong, has many collections on Ong's works. Also, Professor Emeritus, a senior distinguished scholar from University of Minnesota Duluth. And then the last person who I can get in there is Amardo Rodriguez, if people know who that is a Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor of Communication Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University, and I think he's the Director of Graduate Studies there, has many great books, one of which is Communication, Space, and Design. Check it out. Please get your library to get a copy, and let's talk a little bit about valuation and media ecology.